How many of you have heard of magic onions? I made it up, except for then I went and Googled it and found out that Magic Onions is like a website and there's products called Magic Onions, but that's none of that stuff, if you Google, is what I want to talk about today. So magic, as I understand it, the way magic works is the magician gets your attention focused in a place, and while your attention is focused there, the real action of the trick is happening someplace else. So whether it's a card trick or a box that they got somebody in, right, they say, look here, and whatever's going on there draws your attention, and then the sleight of hand is happening someplace else. So your attention is one place, but the real action is happening in a different place. So that's magic. Now onions, in our culture, we have this sort of proverb or saying that you have to peel it away like the layers of an onion. And onions really do have layers. They have a little skin on the outside that can be red or brown or white or yellow. And once you get past that messy bit, then there's even a little thin layer that sometimes as you're peeling, you can kind of roll it back and that comes off. And then you get to the meaty part of the onion, and there's multiple layers till you get down to the core. So magic onions, we'll figure that out here in a minute. Today we hear two parables from Jesus, and as parables go, they're relatively straightforward. Sometimes you can't understand parables because they're cryptic, but in these, Jesus is at a leader of the Pharisees' house, and he says, hey, as he's watching them jockey for the best seats at the banquet, he says, that's not what you're supposed to do. You should take the lower seat. You should be humble and let the host move you up as opposed to presuming to have the seat of honor. This would seem to be a lesson in humility in the world, in worrying less about making space for ourselves and just taking and letting other people have space. Then he looks at the host and says, when you invite people, don't just invite your friends and people that are going to invite you back. And we know what that looks like, right? Somebody invites you over, then you feel like you got to bring a bottle of wine and then invite them to your place. He says, don't do all that. Just go out and invite the people that are poor on the streets. And again, this is pretty straightforward. Is it easy to do? No, but it's not hard to understand. Now, what I find compelling about this passage, though, is the setup. Before you get to the parables, Jesus is on his way to the party, and it says that they were watching him closely. Now, if you pay attention as the Gospel of Luke goes along, the reason the religious leaders are watching him closely is because they want to do what? They want to get him in trouble. They want to trap him. And so they're watching him to see if he will do something they can use against him or say something that is heretical or blasphemous. And again, then they can haul him in. Now, the thing is, Jesus is pretty tricky. So anytime they try to trap him in some kind of word, story, or situation, he always finds some third way through that is not what they're expecting. And it's hard to criticize somebody for healing people and casting out demons. So the best they can come up with is getting on him for doing it on the Sabbath. But again, that doesn't stick too bad to him. So by the time he gets in front of Pilate, they've been watching him very closely, trying to trap him, and Pilate says, I don't really see anything. And so then they say, well, he's stirring up the people. Now, this is both true and false. It's false because it sounds like he's stirring the people up to some kind of armed rebellion, which would get Pilate a little nervous. But that's not true. That's false. What is true, though, is that he is stirring up the people, because as he goes around, crowds continue to follow him because he has stirred up life and love and imagination among them, that life in this world can be something different than what they were experiencing. So they are watching him closely, looking for these negative things that they can catch him in. That is where their attention is at. But just like in a magic trick, the real work that Jesus is doing is someplace else altogether. Well, they're watching for this one thing, something else is happening. And that's where the onions come in, because it is happening in multiple layers. On the top layer is what the people can see. And what they can see is Jesus doing those healings and casting out those demons and teaching and stopping on the street when people have questions and going into the synagogue and teaching in those places. So as Jesus is doing all of that surface stuff, they can see that. Their attention may not be just where it should be, but they can at least see that part. Then you come to the story today, where he tells them these parables. And what he is telling them is what he has already shown them. So in that first layer, he's gone around and he's been humble and he has served people. So then he looks at them and says, listen, it's about being humble and serving people. And so he tells them, and there's other parables and other stories where he's also teaching the people, even as he's kind of showing them what it looks like in life. But after you get past those layers, you get down to the core. And the core comes when he does get crucified. If you think about living life as a human being, and if you take the parable where it says, take the lowest place, what would the lowest place be? Well, getting crucified on a cross after getting beaten and abandoned by all your friends and tortured and carried that thing and then hung up there, that's pretty low. It doesn't get much worse than that. And then getting executed in all of that, right? So Jesus takes the lowest place you can take as a human, but then he gets raised to new life. Which if you think about a place of honor at a wedding banquet, it's got nothing on resurrection. So Jesus has showed what it looks like to walk in the world with humility and service for others. He has taught them how that works, right? And tried to give them words to help them understand it. And then he goes like all the way to this place of death and resurrection to dismantle the structures of death and come out to new life on the other side. And for we, as God's people, what that means is Jesus made a space for each and every one of us to have a place in the world. And that we then no longer have to worry about having a place in the world or a place with God because Jesus has already accomplished that. And so we should then be freed to not worry about our place, but to be humble and to serve in the very ways that Jesus did. Do we always feel, though, like we're free in that way? Or do we sometimes struggle to feel like we have a place? When I transferred colleges after my sophomore year, and they do a really good job bringing freshmen into a university and connecting them to things. Transfer students, not so much. And so the first 3 weeks of school, my roommate that they, I say stuck me with because he had a single room until I showed up, he was gone all the time. I ate all my meals by myself. I didn't know any of my classmates. I didn't have any friends there. And at that point, I'm still like this. If you put me in a place where I don't know anybody, I'll just climb right up, right? So those are 3 long, lonely weeks. And I did not feel like I had a place. I did not feel like I fit in. And I started to think I made a mistake going there. Now, I share that. I also know that I have always had a place in this world, and that there are people who are oppressed and starving and on the streets and living in their cars and in places where they have no voice, that are in a way worse place than I was just being lonely on a college campus. But that is to say that even though Jesus has freed us, we don't always feel that. Sometimes the brokenness of the world leans in on us, and we can feel in places where we don't fit, and we can feel lonely and disconnected. At the same time, the way our culture works, we are really encouraged to fight for our own space. And if that means other people don't get space, that's tough. There's only so much to go around. There's only so much money. There's only so much land. There's only so much oil. There's only so much food. And so we got to make sure we get ours. And I didn't think about that until just now. We've had an illustration of this all week, haven't we? How many of you have been to the grocery store or the gas station? Is there a great deal of humility and making of space for others? No. If you get there and there's only 1 gallon of water and you can grab it, you're going to grab it, right? And so this has been a whole week of watching this unfold in front of us, where we're trying to claim space and make sure that we are going to be okay as a storm approaches. So even though Jesus has done all the work, we don't always feel like we have that space to be free. Which is where those layers come in, right? If he had just died and been raised, we would be fine. But he also taught so that we could understand and showed us what it looked like. Because it turns out the work of Jesus is not all that magical. It's being humble and serving. Making space for others instead of worrying about space for ourselves, trusting that because he has died and been raised, that we are already whole and wonderful and created the way God created us to be. So then the task of the church is to go out into the world and kind of do what Jesus did. Live in that space where we just try to be humble and serve and pay attention to our neighbors. Also, though, to talk about it. Now, I don't mean sometimes we should, but I don't mean we should just walk around spouting parables off to people, right? Walk around the grocery store saying, as you grab water, know that someday the Lord of hosts will come and reduce you to a lower spot, right? But it does mean that we should share our faith and talk about our faith and talk about the people that have made space for us and how that has inspired us to live differently. And then that bottom part, right, the core layer of giving ourselves up for others. And we are absolutely called to do that. And what the Gospels tell us is that when you do that, you actually find life, not lose it. And this is the gift that Jesus has given us. And again, this is not magical. When I was in that space in that college cafeteria, my resident assistant of my floor came over one day and sat down and had dinner with me. Mostly because he felt like he had to, because it was his job and he felt sorry for me. But even though that was the reason, did I get connected? I did. And then I got to know some of his friends, and pretty soon I had a whole group of people, and I felt like I did belong in that place. A couple years ago when I started swimming laps at the YMCA, I would go out and sometimes the lanes were full, and I did not want to inflict myself upon someone else who was having a nice peaceful swim the way I swim. And so I would just stand there hoping someone would be almost done. And then one day the 90-year-old lady who comes and swims popped her head up and said, "Hop into this lane, everybody's welcome." And it was another example, right, of somebody just making a little bit of space. Right? Just enough to make me say, oh, okay, I do belong here because someone has just invited me. I don't know how many of you are tracking the Women's U.S. Open tennis tournament, but last night in the third round on primetime TV, the world number one, who is the reigning champion of the U.S. Open, her name's Naomi Osaka, played the up-and-comer 15-year-old Coco Gauff, who is amazing at the way she can move on the court. And this was like the big hyped match of the tournament so far. And Osaka pretty well dominated the match, but it didn't seem like that because it was so exciting. So then after the match, what always happens is whoever just won gets an on-court interview. So somebody walks out there with their microphone and talks to them. So while that's about to happen, the 15-year-old who won a match at Wimbledon, beat Venus Williams, I think, and then she made it to the third round here, and the whole crowd is there cheering her on, and you can imagine how emotional that is to be all amped up for it and then lose. She's standing there packing up her stuff, and you can see she's trying to fight back the tears. Now, this other number one world, right, this is her spot. It's her time to go have an interview, and she walks over to her and talks to her. And I think what she said was something along the lines of, it's okay to cry, but you're not going to do that in the locker room. You're going to do that here with me, and you're going to share this interview. So this spot that was all hers to have, she shared with this other person who wouldn't normally get to do that. And I think Coco said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think she said, yeah, you are. So then the person comes out with the microphone, and the world number one who has just earned this spot just steps back and lets the person interview the 15-year-old. It was wonderful. And then they came and talked to her, and they said, what do you know, and started talking to her, and she fought back the tears. And she pointed over to the 15-year-old's parents and said, I've known you guys because we train in the same places, and you're amazing. So even when they were talking to her, she was talking about them. And this was amazing because if you've ever seen a post-sporting event interview, do you ever see anything like that? No. You do hear players say stuff like football quarterback will go, well, if it wasn't for the lineman, or the baseball player will say, well, we all got to do our part, right? But those are kind of rehearsed. Right? That's what you have to say. And it never comes across as really humble. But this really did, because it was emotional. And you saw this person, this elderly 21-year-old on the tennis tour, making space for the 15-year-old to say, you belong here. Right? And this is what I think we're called to do as the church. While the world's attention can be on all sorts of scarcity and negative stuff, and even if the world is watching the church and thinking it's hypocritical and judgmental and hateful, the real work can be happening in other places, and the real work is us just living with some humility and serving others, not because we're so good at it, but because Jesus is perfect at it, and he continues to work that through us. So I want to finish with a question. I want you to think of someone who has inspired you. Not a famous person. Somebody you actually know. Like could be a family member, neighbor, friend. Has everybody got somebody? All right. Raise your hand if that person lived with some level of humility in their life. Raise your hand if that person served people in a way that lifted people up. Right? So almost all of you are raising your hand saying, yeah, that's who those people are. So just as Jesus inspired people and stirred people up is what he was accused of doing, that's what we're called to be. To stir people up. And you've experienced it when other people have stirred you up, and Jesus gives us the power to do that in the world today so that we can be like magical onions, drawing the attention right to the things that matter and living with those layers of grace that can touch people's lives and bring God's presence to people so that everybody can know that they have space and are loved. Amen.